Hi, and thank you for joining me. In today's project, we will be creating a Windows Failover Cluster using Windows Server 2019. We will show this using both PowerShell and the Graphical User Interface or GUI, then move on to creating an SQL availability group on top of this cluster. Now, I think this will be a really fun project, so stick around till the end and see how it works out. Before we get started, if this is your first time visiting the channel, please do consider subscribing. Now I will start with the GUI, then look at the PowerShell script to do the same thing. Now just to break down the environment we're working with, we have 3 Windows Server 2019. One of them is the domain controller, which is the DS1. I have SQL 1 and SQL 2. Both of them has SQL Server 2019 installed, Developer Edition, and all are in the same subnet, so they all can reach each other. So we will be installing the Failover Cluster service on both SQL 1 and SQL 2 with the Failover Cluster Management interface or tools on the domain controller. After that, we will create a file share on the domain controller and use it as a witness file share for our cluster. Now, if you need to set up a similar environment to work along with me, do pause the video and continue after your setup is complete. So without any further ado, let's get started. Now the first thing I will do, I will head to SQL 1. I will log in, and here is my Windows Server 2019, the server manager. I will click on Add Roles and Features, click Next. Role-based or feature-based installation, click Next. I will highlight the name, IP address, and operating system that I'm using. There's only one, so I will just hit Next. And Next, because this is a feature, not a role. And here is the failover cluster. Now the only thing you need to do here is basically just highlight it, click Add Feature, and that is it. And just follow along the wizard to install the cluster feature. Now to do this in PowerShell, I have my PowerShell open here, and I'm using a remote machine to execute those commands, and that is why I'm using invoke commands. Otherwise, you will just type the command as is here between the curly brackets. Now the command to install a Windows feature is install-Windows feature, name, and then the name of the feature. In this case, it's failover-clustering. And in the end, I'm adding the credentials since this PC is not a part of the domain. So the first thing we have is that we're getting the credentials. We're storing this in a variable called cred. I'm going to run this. There we go. The domain is g5.local. Here's my administrator, and here's my password. Let me clear the screen below. There we go. The second thing we will do is install the failover clustering services on both SQL 1 and SQL 2 machines. Run the command. Give it a minute to execute, and there we go. We can see both has been successfully installed, and the next step we will do is to restart the servers. And there they are. Let's restart along with SQL 2. There we go. Now the next step is to install the management interface on DS1, and here let me change this to the domain controller DS1. And to do so, we're gonna do the same thing, install Windows feature, but this time name is rsat clustering, and we're gonna highlight include all features. Now this will install the management tool for the failover cluster, and I will run this command. I will use the squeegee to clear the screen below, run the command. Great, now the management tools for the failover cluster has been installed on the domain controller, and this feature does not require restart. So the next thing we will do is to create a file share. We will use this later to create a cluster quorum file share. Now, first I will create the folder. I will call this folder Witness, and I will create it on the C drive. I'm going to highlight the command that is executed remotely, hit run, and the folder was created. Now let's create the share. I will have a share named Witness. I will give it the path of the file that we just created, which is C Witness, and I will give full access to everyone since this is a test environment. If you want to be specific, you can give access to the cluster. To create a new share, you will use the command new SMB share and then name your file share and the exact path that the folder will be in, then your access that you will be using. I will be using full access as I mentioned. If you're executing this on the machine itself, then you don't need the invoke command. And I will highlight this. I will run it. Fantastic. Now we have a share. Now if I opened my run and ds1, then Witness, hit enter, and there we are. The file share is working. Now let's create a new cluster. Now that could be a problem executing a new cluster command remotely. For these commands, we're going to have to log in to the machine itself. And here I have my domain controller. So here is my PowerShell on the domain controller. I'm first adjusting the font size a little bit so it's more clear. I think 13 is appropriate. Yeah, use the squeegee again. Great. Now first let's see how to create a new cluster from the interface. So I will go to Tools. There's my Failover Cluster Manager. Great. There it is. Full screen. Now to create a new cluster, you can right click, create cluster. It's always good to validate configuration first. So I will click on that. Next, I will add the nodes, SQL 1 and 2. Hit OK. OK. And here is my SQL 1 and SQL 2. Hit next. Now it's asking if I want to run all the tests, and sure. Next. Next, and we will wait. And the test is done. We don't have any errors. We do, however, have some warnings. So let's view our report. There we are. And I can see the warning is in network and system configuration. Now, if we look at the network, there the warning in validation of network communication. Now, it's basically saying that each server has only one Ethernet or network interface, which is not recommended. It's recommended to have multiple for redundancy. But since this is a test environment, that's fine. And we go back to system configuration. And we see one warning in software update level. Now it's basically saying we should update the system, which is an acceptable risk since this is a test environment. So I will hit finish. And to create the cluster, we just right click, create cluster, and follow along the wizard. But I will create the cluster using PowerShell instead. So to do so, you will use the command new-cluster. The name of the cluster, I will be naming this SQL-cluster. And we're going to be using two nodes, SQL 1 and SQL 2. There will be no storage for this cluster. And I will add a static address for this, which will end with 200. I will run the command. Fantastic. Now we can see that the cluster was created. Now let's go back to the graphical interface and see we don't have any cluster. So let's connect to the cluster, and that will be SQL cluster. Okay. Yes. And there we go. Here is our cluster. If we look at nodes, there are both nodes, SQL 1 and SQL 2, and they're both up. Great. Now the next thing we will do is to create a quorum file share. to do this, from the graphical user interface, we will right click, hit more action, then configure cluster quorum settings, hit next, select the quorum witness, hit next, and since we have a file share, we will select it. Otherwise, you can have a cloud witness or even a disk witness, but in this case, we only have a file share. So we hit next, enter the file share path here, which is, if you remember, ds1, which is the name of my domain controller, / witness. And click next, and you will be done. Now to do this with PowerShell, we will use this command, set cluster quorum -node file share majority. If you're using a file share, the name of the file share, followed by the name of the cluster. Now highlight this and run. And there we go. If we go back here, let's refresh. There. If we go down here and look, and here is our FileShare Witness configured and online. Let's first come here. Let's open our trusted CMD here. Yes, and let's ping the IP address that we created, which was 10.10.10.200, and we get a response. Fantastic. Now we have our cluster up and running, and we can ping the IP address that is shared by those two nodes, and we also have a FileShare Witness that is also online, as we can see here. Now let's move on to the next step, which is creating a SQL Server availability group on both servers. Now, first let's go to SQL 1. There we go. Now the first thing we need to do is to enable this feature in the SQL Server engine itself. I will open the SQL Server Configuration Manager, open Services, then get my SQL Server here. I will double click it, and I will go to Always On Availability Group, Enable, Apply, and OK. Now it's telling me that I need to restart the service for this to take effect, and I will restart my service here. Right now, until it restarts, let's go to SQL 2, and I will repeat the same steps here. I will go to Always On Availability Groups, enable it, apply, and I will restart the service. Fantastic. And here is our trusted SQL Server Management Studio. I'm already connected to SQL 1. Now I'm gonna connect to SQL 2 instance. Hit connect, there we go. And we do not have any databases. So I will add a test database. I will do so by right clicking on database. I will restore because I backed this up from another server, and I will choose device, open, and I will add the file here. And here is my backup. I will highlight it, hit OK, OK, OK. There we go. I will close out of this, and here we can see is the database. Now if I went to Always On High Availability Group, we will see that I can in fact create a high availability group because we enabled this feature earlier. Now if you are connected already to your servers while you're enabling this feature, you will not have this available for you. You will need to disconnect and reconnect again. Now before I create the availability group, I would like to create a user because we're going to test with this user later on with an application that is using this database. So let's use the master database. There we go. Let's create a login, create login, and I'm going to call this HA login. I would like to create this with password, and I'm going to use the super duper confidential password of password. There we go. And then I will create a database user, tie it to that user, create user, and I will call this HA user 4. That would be HA login. Great. Afterward, I want to add this database user to the role. Let's see here. Here's my security. Here's my roles. Data reader. So I will copy this. Yep. Close it. Come here. I will alter role, which is this one. And what I will do is add member. And that member will be HA underscore user. Fantastic. Let's run this. First, we will create the user. And this, then this. Execute. Okay, yes. Here we need to use the other database. Use HADB. Go. Let's try first this. And this is already created. Let's move on to this database. Fantastic. Let's create our user. Great job. Now let's add that user to the role. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I wrote it wrong. DB underscore. So let's try again. And there we go. Fantastic. Now here I have a script to move the user from this server to SQL 2. So I will execute this and I will copy this. Then I will go to my SQL 2. Where's my SQL 2? There we are, databases. Let's just connect. Here is my SQL 2, connect. A new query. And there it is. Let's run it. Let's run this. And if we go to security, logins, we will see that we do have our HA login here. Fantastic. Now that this is out of the way, let's go to SQL 1, make sure we're connected to it. There we are. Close databases. Let's go to Always On Availability Group, then Availability Group, right click, New Availability Group Wizard, and you will see it is super easy. And we will just hit Next. Now let's name this Availability Group 1, and this will be using the Windows Server Failover Cluster. So we'll leave this as it is. Hit Next. We're going to use this database. We're going to go to Next. Here we have SQL 1 acting as a primary. Now I would like to add a replica, and that would be SQL 2 connect. Fantastic. Now I would like both to have automatic failover. And as you can see, as soon as you do this, the availability mode will change to synchronous commit. So this basically means that the data is written to both servers at the same time. So at any given time, you will have an identical replica of the data on both servers. Of course, this comes at a cost of performance, but I think it is worth it. So I will change this to readable, the SQL 2. Let's check our endpoints. Here we have SQL 1, SQL 2, and as you can see here, it is telling you that this port is required, which is 5022. Now make sure you open this port in your firewall. And in fact, let's open the necessary ports right now using PowerShell. Let's do the squeegee just to clear the screen here. Now this is the command to create a new rule in your firewall. Now, as you can see, I have already created the necessary rules for SQL Server. This is for port 1434 UDP, and this is used for the browser services, the SQL Server browser services. I have an identical one for 1433, which is used for the engine. And now let's use let's just call this SQL Failover. And let's double check the port required. This is a TCP 5022. So we'll go to 5022. and this is TCP, and the action is allowed, and this is inbound. Now I'm doing this remotely, so I'm gonna have to use the invoke command, and I will add this to computer name SQL 1 and SQL 2. Here is my command, and I will use that credential that is cred, and let's run. Fantastic. Moving on. Just double checking my preferences. Here we have prefer secondary, which is what I'm gonna leave this option on. So it basically say its automated backups for this availability group should occur on a secondary replica. If there's no secondary replica available, backup will be performed on the primary one. And here I will create a listener, and I will call this AG1. Let's give this port 5000, for example, and let's add a static IP of 10.10.10.201. Let's hit next. There we go. And it's asking if it will do automatic seeding or full database and log backup. I usually prefer to do this. I'm not sure if I have this file share created, but let's create it now. Let's create a folder. I will just duplicate this command, and I will add the folder named backup. Run. Great. And let's duplicate the file share command. This will be backup, and the name will be backup share. There we go. And let's run. Fantastic. Now we created a file share for the backups, and I'm going to use this file share that we just created. Hit next, and we can see the validation test was passed. Now let's hit next. Here you can generate a script if you want. We don't need that, so we will just hit finish, and it will take a second just to configure the endpoints. Fantastic. Now this is done. Let's close. Go back to our SQL Server. Let's refresh, and we can see the database is synchronized on both. If we refresh here too, we'll see both is synchronized. If you look at the availability group now, we will see AG1 as primary and availability replicas. We have SQL 1 and SQL 2. Availability databases is this one up here, and the listeners is AG01. And I can come here, I can do a failover to the second one to test it here, and click next. I want to fail over to SQL 2. Let's do connect. And next. Now I'm connected to SQL 2. Hit finish. And let's see if the manual failover will work. Fantastic. Now if we refreshed here, we can see that this is the secondary. And if we go to SQL 2, here is the primary. And let's fail over again. Next, yes. Let's connect. SQL 1. There we go. And finish. Fantastic. Now let's test this from an application. Now here is an Node.js test app. It's more of an API actually than an app. So it's communicating with an API that is getting its data from the database. So let's use the server, which is 10.10.10.201, which is the listener. But first let's try to ping that server. There we go. Ping 10.10.10.201, and it's working. Great. Now let's save, and here is my super secure password. Now let's start my app, npm start. There we go. Let's get my browser out. Let's search for customer, let's say 40. And here we have the information. Now let's go back to SQL Server. Here we can see that AG1 is the primary. Now let's go to SQL 1 and do a shutdown. There. Now this is shut down, and refresh, and we can see here that SQL 2 now is the primary. Now let's double check here. Let's get customer 41. There we go. It's working perfectly, 60, whatever. And it's working great. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. It was a really fun project for me, and I hope it was for you too. If you did enjoy this, please do leave a like, share, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.